Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RegGamer.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, have popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be discussing, first of all, the Kaby G, along with the Vega 11 GPU, which appears to reside in the image that has appeared on the internet. So we're going to start doing some detective work concerning that. Then we're going to move over to Nvidia, specifically some comments from the CEO of Nvidia on his take of not just Intel getting into the the GPU market, but also his thoughts on Raja Koduri departing AMD and of course going to Intel. And finally, we'll discuss the CES award-winning GDDR6 memory from Samsung, which will likely be seeing usage in the new Volta GeForces, which will probably be announced early next year. But as I said, first things first, we're going to discuss the Kaby G. So for those of you who have been hiding under a technology rock the past week or so, back on Monday there was a shocking announcement, and I'm actually surprised that we heard the announcement quite at the timing we did. It seemed to be very closely guarded for so long, and then both companies just announced it simultaneously. I expected at least a few more leaks before anything official popped up, honestly. But AMD and Intel both confirmed that they were working together to produce a Kaby Lake-based CPU microarchitecture, which featured a discrete Radeon graphics chip from AMD. Now, Intel are certainly being some level of cagey at the moment. They're not really telling us that much, other than that the more solid details will appear in the first quarter of next year. What we can tell you though, especially given another leak which has just popped up, and this one originates from Bits and Chips, this image is very interesting. Now, before we talk about the actual chip itself, which is sitting right on, well, right center, sorry, of the large PCB, the motherboard itself, at the very top, of course, you can see two sticks of memory, and obviously there are a lot of power regulators and VRMs and other bits and bobs which are dotted around the board, but you can see just how tightly packed everything is. Now, on most mobile designs, and of course I mean laptops here, just for clarification's sake, you normally also need to basically solder on GDDR5 memory. But the problem with that is, obviously, A, it takes a lot of power, and B, it also consumes a lot of board space, which is one of the reasons that Intel decided to go with the Vega chips. And what we have here, on the left-hand side, is the Kaby G processor, and on the right-hand side, there's two dies. The extreme right is the HBM2 memory. It looks like it's just a single 4GB stack. The middle chip, the largest of the two, is definitely Vega. Of course, we don't know the full specifications of this yet. However, there has been some leaks which have appeared on the internet concerning this particular chip, and by which I mean benchmarks. And it looks like the top-end card, processor, features 24 Vega units, and that means a grand total of 1,536 stream processors. Clock speeds are not finalized yet. We're looking at around 1 to 1.2 gigahertz. Of course, this is not only because the silicon is not finalized yet, it's still very early in development, but also B, clock speeds might change a little bit depending upon the vendor itself. So for example, if it gets sold to MSI, they might operate it at, let's say, 1225 megahertz, and Dell might decide to go to 1275 megahertz, or you get the idea. In other words, it depends on how much cooling they've got in place, what the power consumption envelope is that they're looking to target, and so on. So the performance of these chips is still a bit of a mystery. And obviously, yes, we've got benchmarks, but that's not necessarily indicative of final performance, but it does give us a ballpark. It looks like, though, performance in terms of the actual floating point is going to be around the mid-3 range. So let's say 3.2 to 3.4 T-flops, depending upon where the clocks finally end up. That's pretty impressive. It's not quite up to the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro, which sits at around 4.2, and obviously a long way away from the Xbox One X, which is about 6. But even so, this is enough performance to be able to run most AAA games at 1080p, 60 FPS without too much of a big deal, which is fantastic for gamers on the move, but it's also great for people who, for example, might want to do video editing. And that's one of the target usage scenarios would be professionals who perhaps want to do a bit of gaming on the move, but also want to take their lightweight device to, for example, a client's office, and let's say that they are a 3D renderer. Let's say, for example, they work on designing buildings, or perhaps maybe doing some After Effects work or whatever, and the client says, hey, you know, I really like that. I really like what you've done with the design, but we'd kind of like our logo to be maybe slightly different coloured. Could you show us, you know, this spinning animation? I know typically we have our logo in blue, but we'd kind of like it to be more of a silver colour, just because of like the products we're using. Could you show us it in blue? And then, you know, the designer, rather than needing to take the whole thing away, he could just, you know, be able to render it on the fly, or at least preview it on the fly, with a fairly decent graphics card. And that's one of the reasons that maybe Intel have also decided to go with the Vega architecture, because it does excel in compute. As I said, this is still pretty early yet, and, well, people are still weighing in on exactly what this means for AMD and Intel, but it's rather exciting. So if there's one company who obviously have a vested interest in following what's going on, it would be Nvidia. One would make an argument, and it's a very difficult argument to even slightly argue against. Well, that was terrible. And that is that Nvidia are going to be the company which is most impacted. Jensen Huang has recently had a Q&A on, of course, the recent financial call. And he says, and I quote, yeah, there's a lot of news out there. First of all, Raja leaving AMD is a great loss for AMD, and its recognition by Intel probably that the GPU is just incredibly important right now. The modern GPU is not just a graphics accelerator. We just left the G letter in there. But those enormous processors are domain-specific parallel accelerators, and they are enormously complex. The most complex processors built by anybody on the planet today, and that's the reason why IBM uses our processors for the world's largest supercomputers, and that's the reason why every single cloud, every major server around the world has adopted Nvidia GPUs. And he also says that the amount of software engineering that goes on top of that is significant. So, if you look at the way we do things now, we plan our roadmap about 5 years out. It takes about 3 years to build a new generation, and we build multiple GPUs at the same time. And on top of that, there are some 5,000 engineers working on system software and numeric libraries, solvers, compilers, graphics analytics, cloud platforms, and virtualization stacks in order to make this computing architecture useful to all people we serve. So when you think about it from that perspective, it's just an enormous undertaking. Arguably, the most significant undertaking of any processor in the world today, and that's why we're able to speed up applications by a factor of 100. Lastly, Huang decided to discuss the Intel H series. He said, lastly, with respect to the chips that they build together, I think it goes without saying, now that energy-efficient Pascal, GeForce and Max-Q design technologies and all of the software they've created has really been a new design point for the industry, it is now possible to build a state-of-the-art gaming notebook with most leading-edge GeForce processors, and we want to deliver gaming experiences that are many times that of a console in 4K, and that being a laptop which is 18mm thin. I was about to say thick. The combination of Pascal and Max-Q has really raised the bar, and that's really the essence of it. End quote. So obviously, the too long didn't read there from Huang is that he expects that Intel were just pretty much wanting money. They obviously wanted to step into the ecosystem, and it's been pretty obvious that you know, graphics processors have just been beating CPUs in certain workloads, and this has not changed. It's becoming faster and faster and faster and faster and faster that GPUs have been progressing compared to CPUs, especially when it comes to parallelism, parallel workloads. So that would be, you know, artificial intelligence, deep learning, all of this stuff, which is incredibly lucrative and incredibly important for the future. Intel don't just want to make some money, they want to make as much money as possible, so it just makes a great deal of sense. Nvidia, at the end of the day, are currently the market leaders, and as Jensen said, it's not going to be like you can snap your fingers and a new architecture appears, even if Intel have some decent level of understanding of, you know, processors, and they do, and of course now they've got Raja. That doesn't mean much, and I don't mean that as in like it doesn't help. Obviously, if you've never designed a GPU before, it's going to take a lot more work to kind of do that, but with obviously Raja at the helm, that's going to give them a large kick up the butt. However, even so, Intel as a company don't have the technology and procedures in place, and even little things like if they're going after a gaming market, they're going to need to do a lot of rewriting of their software stack. They're going to need to start talking to developers a lot more. If they're going after the compute-oriented sector, they might need to do an awful lot of work when it comes to optimizing their drive. It's not just you design a piece of hardware. There's, you know, everything up from the programming languages. For example, Nvidia have CUDA. OpenCL, of course, on AMD hardware. So there's all of these different discussions on how they're going to do this. If they are going for, you know, fighting against CUDA, is there going to be some type of translation software available to enable developers to quickly port over? It's a lot of questions. Speaking of Nvidia, I figured we could discuss GDDR6, which is likely going to be utilized in Volta. Obviously, this is not 100% confirmed yet, but it's looking very likely. CES is going to be taking place next year. That's going to be January, and Nvidia have already announced a keynote which is going to be taking place on the 7th of January. So really there's two dates if you're looking at the first quarter of next year that could possibly see the announcement of Volta. The first is the aforementioned date of January the 7th, and the second one is the GPU Technology Conference, GTC, which takes place in March. But there's a reason that I'm bringing this up. Samsung have officially shown off a 16 GB, that is gigabit, not gigabyte, I just want to stress that, module operating at 1.35 volts. Okay? Not super impressed, you might not be, but it is also the first GDDR6 module which is actually working correctly. It is an engineering sample, so it's not officially out yet. It's still under development, but even so, the CES board have actually given this damn thing an award. And according to Samsung, it's the fastest and lowest power DRAM for the next generation of graphics-intensive applications. It processes image and video at 16 Gbps with 64 gigabytes per second of data I/O bandwidth, which is equivalent to transferring approximately 12 full HD DVDs, 5 GB equivalent per second, and the new DRAM can operate at 1.35 volts, offering further advantages over today's graphics memories that use 1.5 volts at only 8 Gbps. End quote. Of course, there is also GDDR5X as well, which is considerably faster, but even so, it's not, you know, as fast as this. And perhaps most crucially of all, because the voltages are lower, as I said, once again, 1.35, which is the regular voltage, obviously it could be lowered or higher depending on usage scenarios. That's very damn impressive, because lower voltages, once again, mean that you can have less power consumption from the device itself, and because it's running faster, if you're going with medium spec devices which have a smaller memory bus, let's say 192-bit width, then you can also save space, and because these are larger capacity chips anyway, you can basically have a narrower bus. So in theory, if you were to compare this to like an 8 GB module, which is running at, let's say, 8 Gbps, you can essentially just halve the amount of chips which are required, and I think that's pretty damn awesome. With all of that said, it's likely going to be part of Volta. I do suspect there is a possibility there could be some Volta chips for the consumer market which will be HBM2 based, and that's one of the reasons that, of course, Volta is being delayed, because most likely they didn't feel that GDDR5X had enough performance at the moment, and they probably wanted to wait until R6 was going to be freely available, and also you need to concern yourself with redesigning some of the key components in the actual architecture, including, of course, perhaps most crucially, the memory controllers. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.